Thank you so much. Thank you to everybody for coming. Thank you to inviting me. It's a pleasure to be in Malaysia. It's my first time in Southeast Asia, and it's a beautiful part of the world which I look forward to exploring. Hopefully I'll be able to come here again and again and again. So this is encouraging. Tell your friends, let them buy the books, and then they'll start inviting me for more and more events, hopefully, so I get to see your beautiful country, okay? Deal? Okay, great. So I'm going to be honest, I think most of you pretty much know the Bitcoin standard at this point, right? How many people have read the Bitcoin standard? And how many people know what it talks about or have seen my interviews? Yeah, that's pretty much what I thought. So most of you know most of the ideas in the Bitcoin standard. I could repeat them, but I could also tell you about my next book, which I haven't told anybody about. What do you guys think? So I haven't told anybody about this book. I've been working on it all year long. It's almost done. I finished writing it and I'm editing it and putting some final touches on it. Hoping to get it out by December. Optimistic that I should be able to pull it off. And so I thought it would be a good time to start telling people about it. It's different from my first three books because it is, and it's different from all books. I've never heard of a book that's been done like this. It's an economics book and a fiction book. So it's an economics book written in a fictional world that doesn't exist. So why would I want to write about this? Well, what kind of fictional world deserves an economics book? People barely read economics books for this current world. So why would they read about a world that does not exist? Well, I'm going to try and sell you on it. The idea of the book is what would have happened to the world over the last century if fiat money died in 1915 and all the world's central banks died and we didn't have central banks and we had a happy, beautiful utopia. What would it look like? And so how do I kill central banks in 1915? Well, I spent a lot of time thinking about this. The idea for the book I've had for several years, and I've always, wondered when you think about what fiat money has done. You read the Bitcoin standard, you read about how fiat money financed World War I, World War II, all the horrific things that governments have done. And then there's always the feeling that you get, imagine if this was not possible. Imagine if the printer wasn't there. What would have happened? What would Europe have looked like? What would China have looked like? What would Russia have looked like if they didn't have the Bolsheviks to print money and destroy the currency? All of these what ifs, and there's always, as an economist, you're always thinking of the opportunity cost, of the alternative, the hidden, the unseen, the things that you can't see. And you're always wondering about it. Imagine just how much money and resources and capital and effort has gone into all of these awful, very destructive things that have happened in the 20th century that were financed by money printers, which couldn't have been financed by taxation because it's a lot more difficult. So what I did, I thought about this for a long time, and then what I decided to do was, initially I thought maybe I could invent Bitcoin in 1915, have Satoshi Nakamoto make Bitcoin happen in 1915. And I think there's a very interesting question here which I didn't dig into, which might be worth debating and might be worth writing a book about. When is the earliest time that Bitcoin could have been invented? It's a very interesting question, but we needed to have computers, we needed to have cryptography and so on. So Bitcoin could have been invented earlier, but it couldn't have been invented in 1915. I don't think you could have run a Bitcoin on telegrams. I thought about it, but I don't think it would really work. It's just too difficult and too expensive and too complicated. So instead of Bitcoin, I came up with the idea that we'd have a Bitcoin-like system that is based on gold. So what would that look like? Well, it would be a system where we have decentralized clearance of gold rather than central banks. So what I did was I imagined a world in which in 1910, the Wright brothers invented the first airplane around 1903. But there's there's a great thing that they did, but then they did something terrible after that, which is instead of trying to build more airplanes and make better airplanes and try and make airplanes faster and safer and so on, they spent all of their time trying to stop other people from building airplanes and trying to charge people money for copying their ideas. So they spent all of their life in lawsuits, traveling around, going to see anybody who's building an airplane anywhere in the US or France or Europe and trying to see what they're doing and trying to see if they copied any of their ideas and filing a lawsuit against them. And it was really stressful and made them miserable. And it's why Wilbur Wright died in 1912, I think, or 1913, when he was still pretty young. And it was because of the stress from traveling, from all of that stuff. So in my alternative world, 1910 comes about, and one of the pioneers of aviation was a guy called Octave Chanute. He was somebody who taught the Wright brothers quite a lot of things about aviation. He'd written a lot, they benefited from him. He writes them a letter and tells them, can you please stop being idiots and suing people and just get back to your workshop and build better airplanes instead? So they decide, and they're stressed and they're really unhappy about all of the things that they're doing, so they decide, okay, fine, we're going to drop all of our lawsuits and we're going to start building airplanes instead. So they start building faster, better airplanes. And people in France also start building better, faster airplanes. France was the pioneer, was the real center of aviation. Even though the Wright brothers flew first, people in France had been experimenting and they came very close and they had a lot more active aviation scene. And then that was hurt by the lawsuits of the Wright brothers. So anyway, then the French start making innovations on airplanes. And then one particular guy called Louis Blériot, whom I found reading about the history of aviation, he was the guy who invented the headlight. You know the headlights on cars? He invented the headlight in the late 1800s, made a fortune, so he was very rich. And then in the early 1900s, in the first decade of 1900, he was obsessed with flying. And he was one of the first people to build airplanes. And he was the first person to cross the channel between France and England with an airplane. So he was pretty famous, had a lot of money, and he really loved aviation. So in my book, I decide to make him Satoshi Nakamoto, basically. And he decides that he's not happy about the way that his bank is always creating more credit. He's not happy about how central banks have a lot more credit and paper money outstanding than they have gold on hand. And he's not happy about the problems, that, the business cycles that happen with the banks. And so he decides that he's going, and he also wants to make aviation take off. He wants aviation to become a big industry. And he's a smart businessman, so he realizes at that time aviation was just a bunch of rich people trying out expensive, dangerous machines and exhibitions. So people would go to an open field and watch somebody fly. And that's nice and fun and all, but that's not going to scale a business, right? If you're going to really get aviation to improve, you need to find a commercial application so that you're producing at scale and you're able to finance your production. That's how everything scales. Things don't scale as toys. So how does he starts thinking about commercial application for flight. Flight at that time was very expensive. Building an airplane was expensive. Engines were expensive. And so he decides we need to be moving something around, but that thing has to be extremely, extremely valuable for the weight that is in it, right? And so people are too heavy to move around at that time. There's still no commercial aviation. It's not really sustainable to build the commercial aviation. But there is one thing that is extremely valuable per unit of weight. What's that? Gold, exactly. So he decides, he goes to the US and he convinces the Wright brothers to work together on building a new airplane company, which is going to build new jets, and they're going to use it to ferry gold around the world, moving gold around without having to go through central banks. And his name is Louis Blériot, so he names the company Blériot Transport Corporation, BTC. And the first jet that he builds with the Wright brothers is called the Lightning Jet. So on BTC Lightning, starting around 1910, 1911, everybody's, well, not everybody, but it starts off as a small business. Everybody's skeptical. Everybody says, why do we need that? We already have central banks. Central banks works. This will never take off. It wastes too much energy. It's a silly idea. Obviously, the central banks will shut it down. And Blériot tells them all what does he tell to the haters? Have fun staying poor. And he keeps building, and it starts to take off. In fact, actually in 1910, 11, 12, 13, he gets some decent business. A lot of people want quick clearance of gold, and it allows big businesses like, say, Standard Oil in the US to move money around their company, their headquarters, to their field, to pay their employees and so on. They can move money around now without having to go through the banks, which is a lot faster. So he develops a good business. He starts to grow, he starts to scale, he builds more jets, and then what happens in 1914? World War I breaks out. So of course what happens in 1914 in the real history is all the central banks suspend the redemption of gold, and they tell their people, we can't give you gold right now because, you know, we are fighting the evil French, or we're fighting the evil Germans, or we're fighting the evil Russians, and they're evil, so of course, sorry, we can't give you gold. And they all shut down their central bank redemption for gold. Now in the real world, nobody had any alternative, and so central banks continued to print and print and print more money for 4 years, and they destroyed most of their currencies, and the value of the currencies went down. But in this alternative world, where we have a decentralized alternative to central banking, BTC Lightning Jets, what happens? People keep using the BTC Lightning, they take their gold out of the banks, they don't deposit their gold in the bank. When the government goes around asking people to give them their gold, people don't give the government their gold, they keep it self-custody, and they transfer it using the jets. So what happens? 1 year into the war, all of the central banks go bankrupt because everybody withdraws all of their money. So the British pound collapses, the French franc collapses, the German mark collapses, and governments can't pay their soldiers anymore. So what happens? The war ends. Soldiers stop shooting at each other. The world lives in peace. And suddenly we have a new world where all of the major empires and the major powers are broke and they have no more money. And then we can start thinking about, well, what would the world have looked like? And then there's another 85 years of imagining a world with no fiat money, where money is gold, nobody can print gold, and there are no central banks, so nobody can print gold-backed money that is fake, that is not actually backed by gold. Only private banks exist, and these private banks can't create inflation, because if they do, people ask for their gold back, and then the currency and the paper money that they produce disappears. So we move to a system of full reserve money. There's 100% backing behind the money. All the banks have to have 100%, because if they don't, the value of their money immediately drops on the market. It's like you don't even need to have a bank run. There are exchange houses that are trading currencies against each other, and if an exchange house starts getting a surplus of one particular kind of money, so let's say Citibank is issuing their $100 bill, and JP Morgan has their $100 bill, and Morgan Stanley has their $100 bill, but if a lot of Morgan Stanley $100 bills start coming at the exchange houses will start discounting it. If Morgan Stanley keeps printing more and more, people start discounting. If there's a discount on it, people start getting scared, so they start dumping it even more. So if JP Morgan, or Morgan Stanley in this example, had engaged in inflation, then people dump it, and they keep dumping, and then the currency collapses, or drops in value, or the bank goes bankrupt. So they learned not to try this trick. And if, on the other hand, it was a false rumor, well, then that's just an opportunity for Morgan Stanley to buy their own bills at a discount, which is a great deal for them, because they can just go and get the $100 bill for, say, $95, and then they keep buying them until they raise the price to 100, because they have the full reserve, and then they make money from it. So if you spread a false rumor against a bank, you help them make money. But if you spread a true rumor about a bank, you bring them down. So in this world, we end inflation, we end the business cycle, we end fractional reserve banking, and everything has to run on an honest banking system. And then what happens to governments? Well, governments can no longer print money, so what do? They have to please the people that they work for. They stop being your master. You are the customer now, and the customer is always right, and they need to shut up and listen and do what you want, or else you stop paying them taxes. But also, I went into the political aspect of it, and I thought, well, what would have happened? You know, the war ends, but okay, how do they draw the borders? What is a country? And so, and of course, there's no country that has a lot of money and a lot of weapons that's able to go and shoot people and tell them to draw the borders. They're all broke. So who steps up? Switzerland. The world's most civilized country calls for a peace conference, invites all the other countries to come, and they introduce a framework for self-determination for everybody in the world, where they say, look, this whole idea, you know, remember if you've studied World War I, you know, the Russians wanted to save Serbia from Austria, and Germany wanted to save, or Britain wanted to save Belgium from Germany. Everybody was concerned about a small country they felt so bad about, which just so happened to be targeted by their enemy. So everybody was invading small countries. You know, Britain was occupying Egypt and India and all kinds of different countries all over the world. But they were extremely concerned about Germany occupying Belgium. They're willing to fight for the freedom of Belgium. But, you know, Egypt and India and all these other countries don't really matter, or Cyprus even. So, of course, it was all hypocrisy. They were just using it as an excuse to fight the enemies and to give themselves an excuse to look good in front of their people. So how do you get rid of all of this nonsense? You tell all of those countries that are out there calling for protecting Belgium, protecting Serbia, protecting this or that small country, to agree to this framework for self-determination. Any small group, any piece of land can call for a referendum, and they pay a bunch of Swiss people to come and conduct the referendum. And if the majority of the population votes, you get independence, and all the parties of the ICSD join. And they all have free trade, and we don't have fiat money. So free trade all over the world, self-determination all over the world, and no inflation. So what happens to governments? Then it's a very elaborate thought process about what's going to happen over the rest of the 20th century with that, with governments. So governments become essentially service providers. It's just people you pay a small fee for, and if you don't like how they run your country, you don't get into violent politics about, oh no, let's change this president and put in this president. You just leave the country. You take your entire neighborhood or your entire village or your entire city and you vote to become independent or to go join another country that is more fiscally responsible than the shithole, inflationary shithole where you live. And so what ends up happening is that instead of competing by borrowing more and more, governments start competing by having a bigger saving account. So they start accumulating more capital as a way to attract people from other countries. And the way to attract people is you give them better life, you give them better services at lower cost and lower taxes. And so this, of course, I mean, I'm just trying to give you the general idea. And then we start applying it to all kinds of different aspects of life. Technology, of course, advances more. Imagine what would have happened if we didn't have World War II and World War I ended with just 1 year. Think about how many geniuses would not have died and how many inventions we would have had. And think about all the money and the resources that were wasted on war that could have been invested in capital production, and how much better the world would be, how much more efficient our industries would be. And the way basically that I do it is that technology in the year 2000 is effectively like the technology that we have in the year 2024 today. So the world ends with our current technology. The century ends in 2000 with the technology that we have, but with one major difference, which is a lot more energy consumption, because we are not being robbed all the time with money that is inflationary. We're always using the money instead to accumulate more and more capital, and therefore we can afford more and more energy. So the world consumes 10 times as much energy as we did under the fiat world. Quality of life is much better. Everybody in the world has 24-hour electricity. And it's just all kinds of beautiful, beautiful things happening, and all the horrible things of the 20th century not happening. That's basically the idea of the book.